Good.
Now it says live.
Hi.
It says live.
Good. Hi, I'm Jack Wertheimer, and this is a webinar that is sponsored by the AVI CHAI Foundation. The genesis of this webinar is a series of case studies that were conducted under the auspices of the AVI CHAI Foundation and that are actually available online at the avichai.org website under case studies. These are 19 case studies of Jewish day schools which address different themes in day school education, specifically in the area of how day schools further or enhance their Jewish mission. And today's webinar is based upon two of those case studies, both of which dealt with Tefillah, prayer, in day schools. We have with us today two speakers who will be discussing this issue from the perspective of their own experiences and their own reflections on the matter. They are, first of all, Ray Levi, who is a former head of school at the Agnon School, now it's called the Mandel School in Cleveland, and more recently he was at the Heilicher Minneapolis Jewish Day School, a community day school in the Twin Cities, where he served as the head of school. And in fact, the case study, our collection of case studies, was about that Tefillah in that school. Ray Levi currently serves as the director of the DSLTI program, which is sponsored by the Davidson School at the Jewish Theological Seminary. DSLTI is the Day School Leadership Training Institute program for prospective heads of school. And our second speaker is Shawn SimonHazzani, who was formerly the head of Judaic Studies at the Saligman Middle School, which in Philadelphia, which was a Solomon Schechter school. There still is a Solomon Schechter school in Philadelphia. The Saligman School a few years ago merged with the Barak Academy, and so the middle school is located there. Shawn SimonHazzani currently is living in Israel, where he heads up. He's the director of the Hannaton Educational Center, which offers a year-long study program for high school students, which is based at Kibbutz Hannaton in Israel. And I'm delighted to welcome them also to this webinar. Our topic today is Tefillah, and I wanted to begin by asking our two speakers to reflect a bit on what some of the challenges are with Tefillah that they have encountered in their schools, and also based upon their interactions with people at other Jewish day schools. And from there, we're going to move into a discussion of efforts that were made, initiatives that were taken in their schools and in other schools to address some of those challenges. We're going to start with Ray Levi on this, and then we will turn it over to Shawn.
Hi, it's good to be with you. I want to definitely highlight that I've had lots of experience working in schools and with kids around Tefillah, but that I am not, I don't have the answers. I'm one of the people, like many of you participating, that continues to wrestle with what we should be doing and how to address some of the challenges. I'm going to start with a couple of short stories that are actually some of the positive things that can happen with Tefillah, but in some ways underscore the challenges that we face when we go to work with larger student and teacher populations. The first story is just a quick image. In the shul, one of the shuls I've davened in Minneapolis, each week during the Amidah, the rabbi would come down starting when his younger son was in about first or second grade, and he would daven the Amidah side by side. And so it was really a lovely image to see father and son standing together each week davening the Amidah. And as I watched that, I kept thinking, first of all, the quality of experience, simply doing that together, what does that mean? But I also thought about what was the backstory. What was happening that led the father and son to be together? Did they talk about the individual tefillot that are a part of the Amidah? How much did they talk about what was happening internally? Because most people, when they see us davening, have no idea what we're experiencing inside. They don't know if we're wrestling with a prayer. They don't know if it's a meaningful time, unless perhaps they see us talking to our neighbors during a service. So the key pieces that emerged for me there was how much conversation had happened about the Amidah prayers, and how much did they do together to make it meaningful, and how much did they talk about what was happening internally. My second story is about a kindergarten experience that we had at HMJDS, the Heilicher Minneapolis Jewish Day School, where during one year, about the third week of school, one of our kindergarten teachers became ill and was going to need serious surgery that was going to take her out of school for about 6 weeks. So kids had just begun to form a relationship with their teacher, who is now going to disappear. And when we talked with the students about what was going to happen, one of the things we talked about was what could the kids do to participate in the ways that their family are to support this teacher as a community. Their parents had signed up to do a meal program for the teacher when she returned from the hospital. And one of the things we talked about, and that the teacher actually asked, was that the kids would say the Mishaberach for her each day. And so that became an opportunity to teach the kids very early, certainly not when we would normally have taught the Mishaberach in the scope and sequence of a kindergarten Tefillah program, to learn the Mishaberach, but there was a great purpose for it. And in fact, we taught it to them. And then at the first all-school Tefillah that we had subsequent to their learning it, we asked the kindergartners to lead the school in that experience so that they could invite all of the other kids who knew this teacher. She'd been a kindergarten teacher of long standing, that they too could be participants in saying the Mishaberach. And so what had happened was that even 5, we were showing kids that they could participate in a Jewish communal experience, and that there was purpose for the prayers and praying that they were doing. And so the challenges that I see is, how do we make this happen more often in our school settings? How do we bring meaning to what the kids are doing? How do we help them see purpose? How do we help them understand what's happening internally? And I'm going to suggest a number of really significant challenges. The most significant one that I see is our teachers. How much have our teachers explored their own journeys and their own relationship with Tefillah? How deep is their knowledge of prayer? All too often, especially in community schools, where the teachers may know what they've experienced in their own environments, they may not know what's happening in other shuls. There's a hesitancy to have deep study of Tefillah, in part because of anxiety about how much they know. And so they avoid that difficult, go to the default piece, and we just sort of go through the service each day in the same way. Another thing that I think happens is Tefillah is one of many things we put on teachers' plates. You may be teaching 5 classes, and yes, Tefillah, but we don't actually say, let's look at Tefillah as a class. When are we actually going to set time aside for Iyun Tefillah and dig deeply? And how are we going to take, whether we do that in the context of special study times for Tefillah, or we do it in the context of our Judaic studies classes, how do we carry over what we've done there to provide kavanah to engage teachers, to engage kids each day through what the teachers have had the time to think through and prepare? So I'm going to say, we can talk about many of the things that I've experienced and that are in the case study about what do we do when middle school students begin to lose interest. What do we do about assessing where kids are? How much do we really know about what they know of prayer? But I'm going to just start with this piece of what do we do structurally? How do we help our teachers develop the depth of knowledge and the comfort level to explore Tefillah in a meaningful way so that they can make that experience richer for the students.
Great. Thank you, Ray. You've laid out a whole series of questions that I hope we'll be exploring over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. Before I turn it over to Shawn, I just want to alert those of you who are watching this webinar that there is a box on my screen. It's at the bottom right, which allows for you to pose questions, which I will be passing along to our speakers. I've already received one such question. There will be others from you, perhaps. Feel free to type them in, and I will then pass them along to our speakers. Shawn, please.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit. So my experience was working in this setting was with middle school students, and as was mentioned, sometimes they're feeling that they've already been doing this for a number of years. They either have mastered certain skills, and they want to know why they need to continue to do this. So along with that, when I arrived at the school was 2 years old when I first came, and I started to assess what the challenges were. And so I've just sketched it out. So other than this, it's, you know, when you look at it, it's the time allotted within a schedule, since we have you know, dual curriculum school, and so, you know, look at that, and as Ray pointed out, sometimes it falls by the wayside as to whether this is actually a class or not. The resources allotted for it, for, you know, can you bring in extra resources for the Tefillah, the commitment that the school has to Tefillah as a whole and what that actually means. The students themselves and whether they're interested or not interested in what they're interested in. The families and where they put the importance of it. The teachers or staff that are leading the Tefillot, and then, you know, other than the milieu, the students, the teachers, you have the content itself. And so you have now something which you're trying to teach, which is in a language which is not necessarily natural to the people. It's culturally distant to them. So, and the context in which oftentimes the prayers are talking about, so the actual content itself of the Tefillah isn't necessarily speaking to them. So with all of that, we set out to now create something which would actually work with these middle school adolescent children in suburban America. And so what I took a look at was a number of different things. So the first thing that I really decided that needed to happen was consistency. We needed constancy. So we made it that it was always going to be, from the day you arrived in our school to the day you left their school, there would always be tefillah every single day, whether you were on a tiyul, whether there was a special schedule, no matter what it was. It was our contract with them, so they took away that entire question as to whether we're going to have tefillah or not. Then, within that, we looked at breaking the consistency, or what the students were calling the monotony of tefillah, which was a repetitive experience. And we created different days with different styles of tefillah, with different leaders, with different contexts in which we would create it. We looked at who our personnel were. If we didn't have the personnel within the school itself, I had a head of school who, you know, was blessed to have a head of school who allowed me to bring in outside resources for people who had legitimate experience with exploring, as Ray said, their own prayer experiences, and wanted to share that with the students. So they weren't the teachers in the school. Sometimes they were local rabbis or clergy or Jewish educators. Sometimes they were people from the community outside of it, but who had something to offer our students in a way of looking at tefillah. And then we looked at how we're going to create a multiple way of approaching this. And so I wanted to look at, well, what does it mean to actually pray in the 21st century? We looked at praying in groups, praying in large communities, praying individually, figuring that most conservative Jews do not make it to a minyan 3 times a day, and therefore will find themselves with an opportunity to daven kiyachid a lot more often than they will in a minyan. And so are we teaching that skill as well? And so we started to create a thing which was, you find yourself with 8 minutes. You find yourself with 14 minutes. What do you do? How do you make choices as to what you're going to put into your prayer service, what you're going to cut out of your prayer service? And that led to the questions of what is important. Is there a certain matbea that you have to do? We looked at the traditional matbea. We looked at, and then they talked about their own personal meaning and things that they were interested in. We started to take from the students, what are the things that we're not teaching that you would be interested in us doing? And we heard a lot of responses from them, and we found ways to do that. And then as Ray talked about the idea of iyun tefillah, which is extremely important, but I didn't want it to come at the expense of the actual mitzvah of tefillah, which we always talk to our students about, the idea that they had a chovah for prayer. And so we created time within the schedule. Both the 6th grade curriculum became dedicated for the first semester to dealing with Tefillah and Iyun Tefillah. And then we created times in the week where we had a shortened service, which still hit the matbea that we decided we were going to have. And then it created a space that we could then have Iyun Tefillah. We created mini courses, certain of them that we would determine that they needed to take each year with a certain set of skills and knowledges that we wanted them to acquire, and then certain which were choice for them as to what they wanted to do to enrich the experience. And overall, that led to a lot more buy-in from the students themselves. They began to have fun with it. They saw that they had some ownership over it. We shared the responsibility for leading the tefillot throughout the school, and that created, I think, a much more positive environment to where the point where it was actually, at one point with a parent survey, tefillah actually came in as the second strongest element of the school, to the point when the parent survey came back as to what their students' experience at the school was, which I think was a major success to have that as part of it.
Great. Thank you, Shawn. I want to just respond to a question that has been posed by a number of people regarding the webinar itself, and that is people were wondering whether they have to frantically take notes of this webinar or whether it'll be available online. The answer is it will continue to be available online. There are two webinars that we did based upon this project. We did them during the last school year, and they're both still available online, and therefore I want to reassure you that if you can't get it all down on, in terms of note-taking, you'll have a second or a third crack at it. Shawn, in your presentation, you began to address the second part of our challenge, which is so what do we do, and what steps might we take? And I'm going to turn now to Ray and ask whether you'd be prepared to speak a bit to the question of steps that you have taken or that you're aware that other schools have taken to address. You listed a whole series of challenges. You can respond to any one of those challenges in terms of what was done. And then I'm going to come back to you, Shawn, with a question as well. Okay,
so I'm going to think just a little bit about both what was done, but also maybe go back a little bit before middle school, because I think sometimes what happens in middle school reflects what happened when the kids were younger. Many of the things that Shawn spoke to were things that we also did in the middle school, offering students minyan choices. And I would note that carefully. I spoke about minyan choices rather than alternative tefillah, because I believe strongly that when you take other approaches, you still want to come back to and relate to the actual liturgy, and that makes it a tefillah experience. We looked a lot in the middle school too about, in particular, about how large the groups were, finding that the larger the middle school groups were together, the more challenging it was for us to get kids as fully engaged. The less peer pressure, in effect, there was, the fewer number of students there were around, the more likely, for us to give them active roles, but just more likely they were to participate more fully. But we know about the element of choice for middle school students. One of the things that I think really makes a difference, however, is that I think when the kids are in the lower school, in the primary grades, in the upper elementary, we often mistake those second and third grade, the loud singing for engagement. Kids like singing together when they're younger, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're meaningfully engaged with tefillah. And I think that happens, and that sometimes lulls us into thinking we're doing a good job. And then, of course, as the kids approach middle school age and they don't enjoy doing that anymore, we see the really big drop-off in engagement. So among the things that we did to try to help kids get started with more engagement is actually building on what we often do best. In kindergarten and first grade, before the kids get their own siddur and feel very grown up, they have photocopied Sidurim in binders, and they get to illustrate and talk about the tefillot as they learn them. And so the Sidur becomes very much their own, with visual and verbal reminders about what's meaningful and to connect them to earlier experiences. And then we send them on to a Sidur that's pretty standard, and some of that personal piece is lost. So one of the really great projects that we did in Minneapolis was we actually published a Sidur, which is available still through the school, but the key, in addition to sort of very carefully looking at how we laid out the font and the size of the font in Hebrew so that it was easily read by young kids or older eyes, I might add, and echoed the rhythm of the Hebrew, was we used high-quality illustrations that kids themselves had made. And so the piece was less the Sidur that ended up being, but a Sidur that actually had that the kids had taken time to think about so that they could come up with visual images. So there's one of the kinds of things that I think makes a difference. And again, even when we published, especially in the early years when the kids saw their own pictures of the pictures that their friends had done, that added a dimension to the experience. And there are many ways that schools continue to do that, using Post-its in a traditional Sidur. The new Koren Sidurim have both illustrations and actual blank spaces for people to answer questions, give some thought, and reflect. I think I'm going to stop there because so many of the things that we also did, the option for choices, Iyun Tefillah, balancing out some of those choices. What were the mini courses or the mini that we wanted, that we were optional, and what were ones that we felt were going to cover important exposure that we felt all of the kids needed to have in the course of their middle school experience, were things that we also did.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ray. Shawn, are you back, Shawn? You're still muted, Shawn. You're
Sorry.
still muted. Okay.
Hold on.
Yeah. So, Shawn, I wanted to ask you two questions. That
yes.
One of them actually relates to something that you spoke about earlier, and that is, when we think about Tefillah, our focus very often is on, so how are we going to get our students to participate in Tefillah at school? But you made a point of saying that you also worked on Tefillah b'chidut. What do you do when you're on your own and you have a limited amount of time? I'm curious to know whether you have any reason to know or suspect that, in fact, students outside of school did engage in Tefillah, especially when they were not in a synagogue or a part of a minyan. In other words, did this carry over, or was it more of an academic discussion? And my second question is, what's a kotel minyan?
All right. So, anecdotally, so yes, we know that there were some students that did. It's self-selecting as to who reports back to you that they did those kinds of things. But we often did a contest of showing yourself. Take a picture, a selfie of yourself in Tefillah at a youth group function while on a Boy Scout outing or something like that, and then talk about it when you get back into school. And so we had people that did it. It was a way that we could bring the outside world into it and also try to connect it and show that there's a time to do it. Occasionally there was assignments. You're heading out for vacation and stuff, and I want you to try. If you're going to some place that's awesome in nature, we want you to just take 5 minutes of that and to think about some of the prayer, and then come back and tell me about that experience and what you recited in that space. And so we did that. We were trying to link it, and we had some successes with it. I still have some communication with some of my former students, and I know that it carried over to their lives, where they were able to tell me that it was very helpful to have learned what they could do when they didn't have that much time, or what happens if you don't have an organized minyan. And then with the things that we did, and I'll talk about the kotel minyan in just a second, it'll bridge into it, which is that skill to just be able to step into whatever the context is, and oftentimes people are going to call on you to lead a minyan, and you need to be able to step up and do it. And so that leads me to the Kotel Minyan. So the Kotel Minyan was, we were 150 students at some point in our middle school. We would come to the auditorium. That was originally the space we were given for Tefillah, and there were certain days where everybody had to daven during the same half hour in the auditorium. And as Ray pointed out, sometimes that's not conducive to middle school behavior and to engagement. And so what we would do is, as they would walk in, and we would not announce which days it was going to be that it would happen, we would just count them off by tens and get them started, and you'd catch the next train of the minyan. And you walked in, and you, as a group, knew that when it was Kotel Minyan Day, you were responsible in that group of 10. And so now all of a sudden we have 15 Shlichei Tzibor, and we have the noise going around in the room, and you're davening without being able to necessarily focus only on what your group. And then you would start to see, because it's middle school, a little bit of competitive edge going on. So if one group would sing something, then the next group next to them would pick up and sing even louder for the next one. And then you're getting into this raucous kind of nature of it, and people who would be davening, and sometimes they would share the responsibility around the circle of 10 people that they were doing, and sometimes they would have one person who would take them through the entire experience. And that way we created a much wider range of people who, without having to think about it and having the anxiety of leading, they would now have a much smaller group. There's the anonymity of it's in a big group, but you're only with a small group of people, and you get to experience just leading a small section of the tefillah, if that's what you're comfortable with, or taking a full pull, we would call it, of doing the entire service. And so it broke up a number of different ways, the contexts and the things, and it created a lot of energy in the room for the students.
Great.
Can I just add?
Sure.
Okay, it's just something to Shawn's comment that came to mind because we were talking about davening individually. I saw a really great experience at the Schechter School in Northbrook and outside of Chicago, where middle school students were asked, as their homework was to spend, I don't know exactly how much time, but say 5 to 8 minutes of just silence. Nothing going on, no music, no anything. Could be meditative, might not be, and to journal about that for a few days. And then they also went into, all right, now you're going to use that same amount of time with some liturgy, and to see what people's experiences were with that, and to see whether, as many of the kids struggled with the amount of silence that they had, and the degree to which the liturgy then began to allow them to use silent and personal prayer time in a more meaningful way, really came to light through that experience. I thought that was a really great way of working with kids and really helping them see the value of the liturgy through first seeing how hard it was to meditate and be reflective without any kind of structure.
So I'm going to add on to that one also a little. We did something similar with that, and then we also had them write their own tefillah, and then try to daven that tefillah. So we did it. We had them edit it to what they were really comfortable with, and then we had them daven it, and we talked about it after one day of davening. Did that say what you wanted it to say? Then we had them come back to that same tefillah a week later. Are you still in that same space where that tefillah actually means to you, and that's what you would want today? If you were coming back with that, would you want that to be? Now try davening, write it a new one for where you are. Try davening it every single day. And then tell me, and then we would talk about what it means to have a set liturgy, and maybe it doesn't speak to you every single day, but it's speaking to a community of people, and it's catching a wider range. As we would talk about how even their own words would get tired after a week. They couldn't stand hearing their own, which they thought was the most magnificent prayer a week ago. Now they can't stand it. And so we would talk all about that, and we would talk about how things, become tradition and get into the Siddur and stay in the Siddur, and then we would use the Siddur as a scrapbook kind of also of Jewish travels and Jewish history. We would look through and try to figure out what was going on when they wrote that tefillah for us to experience, and so especially with Hallel, and that really became something when we made our trip to Israel, that it really became alive, and the kids who had already been dancing through Hallel and everything like that now really took it when they could actually stand there and see the nature that it was kind of expressed through the Hallel, and it became alive, and they brought back pictures to put in their Siddur and to keep them in there as part of that scrapbook.
Great. Great. So I have a number of follow-up questions of my own, but I actually want to read to both of you some of the questions and comments that have been generated so far during this discussion, and then I'll be inviting each of you to comment on whatever you want to comment on. In other words, from these questions and from these comments, you don't have to cover them all, obviously. So the first question stated, I work in a Solomon Schechter school in South Florida. We're a relatively small school, yet have a diverse student body in regard to Jewish knowledge and background. With Tefillah, there is an issue of respect. Those who don't know the Tefillah get bored. Those that do know it but don't have a connection get bored, and those that do have a connection either are frustrated and or misbehave because their friends are. Misbehaving, I assume that means. We are a very small Judaics faculty and don't really have an option for only alternative minyanim because families want their kids to have the experience. Any suggestions? That's one question. Some follow-up questions. What role does the staff's own relationship with Tefillah play in all of this, which is something that you, Ray, raised in your initial comments? When teachers feel disconnected from Tefillah, how can they be positive or supportive dugmaot for their learners? In what ways can schools support the spiritual development of teachers alongside their learners? And a second follow-up question is, just one sec, what do you recommend for teachers who want to use the allotted time for Tefillah to actually daven but feel they can't? Whoops, somebody just wrote a question and therefore I've lost my spot. Bear with me, please. Sorry about that. I got to find where I was.
My recollection of the question when it went across the screen was teachers who want to daven and kids who don't.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right.
And
yes.
So how do you work with that?
Exactly right. Yes. And then another question: how can a school start to change the culture of Tefillah, where students may have a siddur in their hand but don't feel the need to even open up the siddur? It is difficult because no one can force anyone to actually daven, but the atmosphere might make it uncomfortable for those students to actually daven due to peer pressure, and actually praying is against the norm of the peers, that is. This applies to boys and girls, but particularly to the girls, since it is an Orthodox minyan and they do not lead services. And last of all, do you do all of your teaching during your minyan time, or do you have a different time for instruction about Tefillah? Again, this is a range of questions. You don't have to answer them all, but we have folks who are watching this webinar who have things on their minds, and let's see whether we can try to address some of them. Shawn, can I put you on the spot to start?
Sure. So I'll address, first I'm going to take the one for so for me it was very important that the teaching about Tefillah would also be separate. So there were certainly times where as the Rav Beit Sefer, I would teach something from the Siddur or something that I wanted them to focus on in the Tefillah. And so use that for a little bit of a unit kavanah at the beginning or in the middle of a Tefillah, and sometimes a Dvar Torah. But in general, I wanted a separation between the time we were learning Tefillah and the time we were davening. I really thought that was important in the setting that I was in, and so we made that happen. For the question about the school where it's a small school and it's a small faculty. So as I said, within some days I was allotted. I had all 150 kids for the same 30 minutes, and I didn't have other staff that I could break into. So the question is, how do I, within that setting, change what we're doing within that? And so for me, some days it was large group minyan. Sometimes it was all together. We did a whole thing. I taught the Rov Am Hadrat Melech, which is when everybody is together, God feels the rumble of the of the people, and we would do a super loud minyan, and we would all be shouting, and let them shout and let them have fun and do things. I would break it into certain days where we would do cacophonous minyan, which was to try to be everybody doing a slightly off time with each other. So for me, it's serious fun with Tefillah, and I could break it into all different ways in which they could do that, even with a small staff. And that leads me into, what do you do with staff that might not want to be in the room, and staff. And so one of the things when I first arrived at the school, they had a thing which was all Jewish studies teachers had to be in the room. None of the Jewish studies teachers needed to be in the room, and that led to tension among the staff. And it led to, for me, it was the scene from Blues Brothers where the sheriffs are all standing around the theater with their guns waiting for the Blues Brothers to finish, and that's what it looked like in the room. The teacher standing there waiting to catch a child doing something wrong. And so I cast all the teachers out of the room and said, I'd rather run this all by myself with 150 kids if that's how it's going to be. I only want people in the room who actually want to have a Tefillah experience with the students. And it turned out there were actually teachers from the non-Jewish staff who preferred to be in the room, and people from the Jewish studies staff who didn't want to be in the room, and that was fine. And and that led to actually student teacher development, which ended up with two Jewish non-Jewish studies teachers who ended up having one who went through an adult bat mitzvah at the age of 50-something years old, decided that it was time for her to do this, and she did it in front of the students, and the students actually taught her how to read Torah. So that was an amazing way to give back to it. And another teacher who really came from a very secular background, who took on a role within the Tefillah community, first through discussion-based things, but then sat and met with me on a regular basis and actually learned some of the tefillot privately so that she could understand things and follow along. And so there was quite a bit of that development that was taking place just by trying to make it a more conducive environment for everybody to feel something in.
Right. What a novel idea. General studies faculty playing a role in this arena as well.
Yes.
Great.
So I'm going to try to answer some. I'm going to start with the teacher piece, and again, I really think that one of the things that really is important for the kids to see is that there are people there who aren't there just because they have to be. In other words, it's expected that the school rabbi is going to be at Tefillah because she or he is, the school rabbi, and rabbis come to Tefillah. And I think there was even the feeling maybe that the Judaic studies teachers had to be there. And so one of the things we really looked for was who wanted to be at Tefillah as well. And we invited, in some of the cases, it was non-Jewish general studies teachers who were interested in coming, as well as Jewish general studies teachers who weren't deeply knowledgeable. And we invited questions, especially during the times when we were doing Iyun Tefillah. We would invite questions, and often the teachers' questions were, generated discussion that a kid's question might not, and yet the fact that adults were involved was really important. And so I think another real piece of this is, and I think, Shawn, you said it in your opening statement about what are the resources that we commit as a school and what's the school's commitment. When we made a really serious commitment to Tefillah, we also needed to set staff professional development time aside for that. And so that became a part of our staff meetings, all of which were focused on different aspects of professional development. But it was an opportunity for people. That was when we started to do some of the thinking about your own relationship to Tefillah. That was when it even was permissible for people to be wrestling with questions and to say that, or to say that they weren't particularly attached. It was also when we exposed people, because we were a community day school, and I saw a question that flashed up about that as well. We exposed people to different Sidurim. And we asked people to find different things that were meaningful to them. Or we did a chalk walk once where we put up the themes and the Khatimah of each of the Amidah prayers, and we asked people to write something about why a particular prayer or that theme was meaningful to them. And so we, in effect, did with the teachers some of the kinds of things that would help them look more deeply. And then we really had to set time aside. We couldn't always do it that only one person was in charge of Tefillah, so especially in the lower school. So we really had to work with people. And that gets to that question about the teacher who wants to daven. I think we have to really look at our roles and help the teachers understand that we are an educational institution. We are not we are not simply the Beit Knesset where people come at particular times to daven. We're educational institutions, and if we're educational institutions, we really need to take the time to do the teaching. And what I would really work with the teacher or teachers who simply want to daven is to say, in your role as teacher, how can you use that time when you're actually working with the kids and helping them engage so that when we do daven together, they will want to do it and it will be more meaningful for you. I think that's a piece. So underlying all of this, and I want to really put that out there as a bigger challenge of the school, is the allocation of time, the allocation of time to work with teachers, both collectively and individually. And really, and to see if your rabbi in residence or somebody who plays that role really is taking time not just to work with kids, but to work with teachers and to provide a safe place for some of that exploration. And so that, again, it comes down to setting aside the resources to make it possible to get to this next stage and address some of those questions.
Great, great. So I want to throw both of you a curveball now and ask you about parents. And I want to introduce my question with a little story of my own. I spoke with the principal of community day school who told me that a couple of weeks before my conversation with him, he was approached by a prominent member of his board who was aghast and furious because this board member's son would not bring his tefillin home over the weekends, and on Sunday mornings did not daven. And from the perspective of this parent, the school had failed abysmally, and it was an outrage to him. At which point, the head of school said to him, well, I really can appreciate why you're so upset about this, but tell me something. Does your son ever see you putting a talis and talit and tefillin on a Sunday, or any other day for that matter? That head of school left very shortly afterwards. But the point I'm driving at here is that that parents are part of the equation, and often are not necessarily allies in this process. Often it's a case of do as I say, not as I do. Or they may simply rely upon the schools to do all the heavy lifting and not play a role in this. So I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts about the role that parents need to play and possibly can be recruited to play in this process of teaching children about Tefillah and how to engage in Tefillah. I told you it was a curveball.
No thoughts.
You want to go, Shawn?
I said no thoughts. My answer, it's very simple. He asked if I had any thoughts on it. Nope. So, hold on 1 second.
Okay. All right. If you want, I can begin.
You go for it, Ray.
I can offer some thoughts. So first, of course, is that I think the question that you've raised, every school is facing in some form, and it comes in many ways. It comes from those parents who are very serious about their expectations, particularly as the kids get older, and about the halachic expectations, and then there are parents for whom they vote with coming late to school if tefillah is the first thing. And one of the things we actually did was we moved tefillah out of the very first time slot, because again we said this is we didn't want to give any, it was serious enough that we were going to do it at the second time slot when we know everyone is here. But enlisting parents really is a significant challenge, and the fact that kids don't see their parents in that role is or davening makes it in some ways harder. But what I'm going to start with the notion that we know, and there's Robert Coles years ago did research on the spiritual lives of children that showed that even in homes that are very secular, kids have active spiritual lives. And so, in a certain sense, we have to ignite that flame or keep that burning in kids. Independently of the parents, but at the same point we have to bring the parents on board. Actually, one of the things that we opened up our minyanim, particularly in the middle school, was we opened them up to parents, for parents to come, so that they could daven alongside their students once or twice a week. Again, in part, so that the kids would see other people who didn't need to be there. But the other part is that we really have to engage our parents in some dialogue as well. When we began, were a K through 6 school, and when we added 7th and 8th grade, we spent a great deal of time developing that program. And one of the things we did was we invited someone from outside with expertise, and so we invited Ben Mann, who is now the head of school at Schechter, Manhattan, to meet with not only our faculty, but with our parents to talk about expectations for middle school tefillah. And he was at that point a middle school director, and he talked about what tefillah asks and the developmental challenges. And then we asked the parents what were their goals and expectations of tefillah. And when we had that discussion, parents thought much more deeply. We had a very broad cross-section of parents, by the way. They're ranging from families who affiliated Reform to parents who were maybe not very religiously engaged through modern Orthodox families. But what emerged through that was discussion of we want the experience to be meaningful for the kids. And then I think we have to figure out how we get some of the parents involved in the school or in davening more, rather than criticizing and saying, do as I say, not as I do.
Good. Okay. So I wanted to now ask you both about, both of you have made reference to the challenges that crop up, especially with middle school kids. My impression is that tefillah with elementary school kids tends to be a somewhat easier process. Kids like to sing, and an effort is made to sing a great deal of the tefillah, but that the rubber hits the road when it comes to middle school kids and perhaps high school kids as well. I'm making assumptions here, and I may not be correct in what I'm saying.
I would disagree with you entirely. I think that yes, they do like to sing, or they're much more willing to follow along with that's what the school is saying that they should be doing. But what I find is, in having conversations with kids when they arrived at the 6th and 7th grade level, and they would tell me, well, I've said, the Aleinu now 750 times over the course of my school, but I've never studied it. I have no idea what it means. I don't know why I'm saying it, and I really don't want to say it anymore. I'm sick of it. And so to me, that while it was successful in that they mastered the ability to sing it in a group with other people, I'm not sure that I would say that that's a success. So it really becomes the question of what is the goal of elementary school tefillah. Is it a performance that they're doing in order to eventually participate in a minyan? Is it a learning for mastery and understanding? Is it to create the meaning, which Ray has so eloquently spoken about, for them to understand it, and to have feeling for it? Is it for them to participate in a living tradition? I think we really need to set those goals, and I think that really needs to come into effect starting from kindergarten. It doesn't mean I'm against mastery and recitation of prayer, but I want it to be in the service of something other than just repetitive, because that's what the staff knows how to do, and you can just kind of knock that out in 20 minutes, and we simanu V, we put a little V next to it. Yes, we prayed.
To which I would say amen, and perhaps add really again, especially in the lower schools, in the elementary grades, sometimes parents worry, or teachers worry, they won't quote unquote learn the prayer. More than enough times over the course of an elementary school career to say the prayer and learn that piece of it, even if we don't say that prayer every day. But the real significant line that I think you talked about is like, what are our goals in Tefillah? What is it we hope we will take away? And that's a question hopefully we ask in all of our other areas of study in schools. But I don't know that we've explored that as well as we should. But if we start with that understanding, what do we hope to get, the end result? What will our kids look like? What will they understand? What will Tefillah mean to them? What will a Tefillah experience be like for them? If we ask those questions, then we can begin to design curricular experiences, and those curricular experiences aren't simply what performance or learning them. But we can really build the building blocks. We can explore the meaning and then come back to a particular prayer in 4th or 5th grade that was done in 1st and 2nd grade, because again, the kids are going to bring a different developmental perspective to it. But we really, are we asking really in a deep way what the goals are of Tefillah in our schools and for our kids?
Good. I thank both of you. I think those are very rich answers to my question, and I'm fine with the pushback that you gave me. So what I want to follow up on, though, especially as you've both formulated it in terms of goals, can you tell us a little bit more? It's been touched upon already, about work that you have done or you've seen done with the teaching staff to kind of work through some of those questions of goals. Are there any examples that you might be prepared to cite from your own work or that of others where there's been a conscious, a deliberate effort within a school to work with the faculty to think through what are our goals and how are we going to attain them, specifically in regard to Tefillah?
So, yes and no. I don't know that it was in such an organized fashion to do it, but I remember in my very first year, where one of the general studies teachers actually challenged me at a staff meeting, which was, where we came in, and I was brand new in the school, and they were doing the prayers in a set way, and it was more of the performance model, and that was what had been established. And so the teacher said to me, if I came in and did the same lesson in a frontal way every single day of the year in my math class, I would be fired within a week. And yet in Tefillah, that's what you're doing. You stand there, you daven the exact same liturgy in the exact same manner in front of the kids, and you do that. And I think at that point she had said, it's 170 days a year over the course of 9 years that are in our school, so they're just getting the exact same lesson 1,200 times. And that really struck me, and so it led me to really thinking about what we were doing and how we were approaching this. And so then we started to look at, what do we do as far as differentiation for kids who had different learning styles and for kids who had different desires for what they wanted from their Tefillah. And then we started to put it in, and so then we opened up the conversation. So part of it is that this is not necessarily a knowledge-based subject, so it's not something that you're going to master it and then move on to the next level. When you're davening, part of it is that we're trying to teach obligation. And so that is a curricular goal. And how do you do that other than through some repetitive aspect of it? So then we would open that up and try to have that conversation in the staff, and then we would create other goals that we would talk about with the davening, and then talk about how we can do that. And so it was a little more ad hoc. It was a little more open conversation for staff who wanted to participate in that conversation. There were plenty of staff who did not want to, and I didn't want that to be part of it. And so we would have certain days in faculty development where we would have the people who wanted to talk about the continued development of Tefillah would meet while another group was doing another topic, and that way we would have kind of a sounding board of the people who wanted to be developing this would actually be in the process of developing it, and therefore developing themselves along with it.
Great. Ray?
So I'm going to say that I wish I were I wish I were now, starting a program, because I think based on what I know now versus what I knew 15 or 17 years ago, I think we started a little bit backwards. We really started with at HMJDS looking at when we would introduce Tefillot, and as we introduced them, how would we learn about them? And we did it, and when would we revisit it? And we kind of created a scope and sequence. But I don't think we explored as deeply as we should have the ultimate goals. And I think we came to some of that later in some of the work we did with people exploring their own relationship to Tefillah. And I think, I know much more now as an educator about learning about how to, like really starting with where people are in their own journeys and what their own meaning is, and then relating that to the kinds of experiences we develop and setting goals. I would mention, by way of sort of two places to look, one of the schools that I think has done this in a very thoughtful way is Schechter Manhattan, in terms of really thinking about their goals and how, and a lot of attention to how Tefillot are introduced and how the experience is designed. And in terms of setting goals and thinking about that, contact Susan Wallet Pardes in Jerusalem, because she has done a whole project that was started last year, and I believe there's going to be another project this summer around really trying to see if people could identify goals. And one of the things that she will speak to quite eloquently is that we all have, a list of 25 goals, and how do we really pare them down to decide what is most important, both in terms of what we can not only allocate time and resources to, but what will ultimately impact kids down the road.
Terrific. It's a wonderful note on which to conclude. Before thanking our two speakers, I want to draw attention to the larger project, which all of you who are watching this are welcome to take in and on your own. It's a series of 19 case studies of how Jewish day schools enact their Jewish mission. There are case studies that deal with Tefillah, with Hebrew, with Israel, with bringing all their stakeholders on board. The people who join me in this project are names that are well known to you, people such as Cheryl Finkel and Josh Elkin and Alex Thompson and Michael Berger and several others. These are case studies that are available for you to download at no charge, and some of them might be helpful to spark conversation within your school, with your teachers, with your parent bodies, with your boards, and with others. A warm thank you to Ray Levi and to Shawn SimonHazzani. Did I just flip your name?
No, you got it.
You got it right. Who have joined us this afternoon for a very rich discussion of Tefillah. And I thank you all for having tuned in to us. Good afternoon.
Laila Tov.